Well folks, welcome to the video where we're going to show you how to make miniature hinges for use in jewellery and in miniature furniture. So here's an example of the kind of thing that we're going to make in this video. So I hope you've got your tools ready and we'll move on. Okay, so the first and most obvious thing is that you need to work out what size your hinge needs to be. And in order to do that you need to measure the footprint area on the piece of jewellery or the piece of miniature furniture that you're going to make. And the sizes that you need are pretty obvious really. You know, you need how wide you want the hinge to be in total once it's been made, and also how long you need it to be, what sort of size you're going to make the hinge pin, because you can make quite chunky hinge pins and you can make quite small fine ones depending on what you want to do. Okay, so just an introduction to some of the terminology that we're going to use. This piece of the hinge here, this I'm going to call this the tab, and I'm going to call this the pin tab, and you'll see what I mean later, because these pin tabs are connected to the tab and they have to be measured correctly. And this is the pin, which is the bit the hinge revolves upon, and it goes through the center of the hinge. Okay, so we're going to need the width, the length, and the metal thickness. So from a side profile, this is what your hinge kind of looks like. Obviously my drawing isn't perfect, but your total width is going to be this length here plus this length here, which in many cases is going to be the same, but it won't always be. There are going to be some hinges where these two lengths are different, and I'll show you an example of that in a minute. And then you're going to need this length here. Now typically this area contains the hinge pin, so here's a bigger drawing of it. Contains the hinge pin and it's folded around with the sheet metal. So the width of this is going to be the wire diameter, which is that there, plus 2 times the thickness of the metal, which is that there and that there. So these are the sort of measurements that you need to work out in order to calculate what size your hinge needs to be. Now then, the next thing we're going to need to do is to work out how long this pin tab needs to be, so that when we lay out the metal and cut it out, we've got the right size. And that's what I'm going to deal with next. Okay, so getting back to this subject of how long the pin tab needs to be, what you would do then is you would get a piece of metal and fold it around the intended pin wire, mark it off with a scribe. This is a scribe here, and then unroll it again, and I'll just give you a quick demo of that in a second. You're going to unroll it again, and then you're going to measure between there and there, and that becomes your pin tab size. And when I mark out the metal in a few minutes, you'll see exactly what I mean there. So you roll it and then unroll it and then measure, and that gives you your pin tab size. In this particular video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use 0.4mm brass wire, which is just a bit less than half a mil, right? And I have determined by this method, right, that my pin tab size will be 2.5mm. And make a note of that in your logbook, because every time you use this combination it'll be the same, so you won't need to do it again then. Okay, so we start this little exercise by taking a piece of brass like this. We then take our piece of brass and we mark it off with engineer's blue. You can also use a blue felt tip pen if you wish. So then you want to take a piece of 0.4mm wire, which is this here, and roll the brass around using silversmith's flat pliers. And then, as you can just see there, just there where I've been along with a scribe and scratched a line. Okay, so these are the silversmith's flat pliers, and they're called flat pliers because the inside of the jaws do not have any serrations. They're completely flat so that they don't damage the surface of the metal when you're trying to make very delicate pieces of jewellery. And this is the scribe that I used, but you could use any scribe as long as it's nice and sharp and it can get into that crevice just there. Okay, so using a steel ruler we can then determine that we essentially have, if we just adjust that a little bit to there, we essentially have 2.5mm that we need to make the rollover tab on our hinge. Okay then folks, just to summarise quickly what we've just done, we've rolled the metal over with some 0.4mm wire, and we've scribed at a mark so that we can tell how long that is. We've unrolled it. The pin tab size we need to create is going to be 0.4mm brass wire with a pin tab size of 2.5mm. So now we know what size to use when we design our hinge and lay the hinge out on a piece of metal. I'm just going to briefly talk about what materials to make the hinge pins from first, and then we'll go on and lay out the metal. Okay, so one last thing before we start is the pin material. So when you're making a hinge, you need some wire to wrap the tabs around so that the hinge has something to pivot upon, and it's called a hinge pin. And traditionally, if you use something like silver or copper, it's too soft, and what happens is it just disintegrates like cheese after quite a short period of time, and then you'd be stuck with a hinge that doesn't work properly and needs repairing, and it isn't really very good. So a much harder metal is brass or bronze, but mainly brass, and that is a well established, well tried and tested hinge pin method, and it is good and it does work for reasonable loads over long periods of time. You can also use mild steel, which of course is much stronger and harder than brass, and that's fairly well established too, as it happens. And you can use spring steel and you can use stainless steel. Stainless steel is generally just for light use because it is quite brittle. Spring steel would probably be the most durable, in fact. The thing you've got to watch with the last two and the spring steel is that you can't cut these with silversmith's pliers, which is why I don't use these methods, because if you cut steel with silversmith's pliers, they're not case hardened, so they're only designed for soft metal, and you end up with a notch in the edge of your cutters or your shears, whichever you use, and that's not really very good unless you've got a special pair that you just use for that kind of purpose. So you've got to buy case hardened small steel cutting shears, which are pretty expensive, assuming you could even get hold of them, that is. So I recommend the brass. I just thought I would go through that with you because I've seen people using silver and copper before, and it's maybe not the best thing to do. Okay, so now we're going to lay out the metal. Okay, so here's an example of a hinge, and this is on a muscle shell box, and you're going to need to know pretty much the footprint area that you're going to need it to sit in, and you're going to need to know, if you look at it the other way, I'm trying to keep this in focus while I'm doing it, you're going to need to know the footprint that way too before you start making the hinge, and you need to have an idea of how bulky you want that to look too. So let's just look at another example. Okay, so here's another example, and what you can see here is this one has quite a narrow tab profile, and that's so that when you put the hinge onto these bendable flanges, essentially, they don't become too thick and then you can't bend them. So that's the reason why they've been done that way. So here's my last example, and this is a hinge which has been made onto a locket, and as you can see, one tab on one side is quite large because it's decorative, and on the other side there's only a small area where you can attach the tab on the other side, so the other tab side is quite narrow. So it's not always the case that the two tabs on either side of your hinge are going to be the same size. It depends on pretty much where you are going to place the hinge. This is a hinge constructed in a very similar way, and again it's got this particular tab is loose, it's not fixed down because it's a catch, and this side of the hinge is decorative and it's a different shape. So you need to bear that in mind, I think, when you're doing this kind of thing. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this video, making tiny hinges for jewellery and dollhouse furniture. Hope you enjoyed the video. Look out for more videos. This is Avian signing off now. Thanks so much for watching. Bye.